Hello and welcome to a quick intro on Photoshop. We are going to cover a little bit of the interface and some of the tools that are going to be used throughout the term. I'm going to go over each tool that we will be using briefly. However, I will go into how to use each tool specifically as we progress through the term. So while I will be covering a lot just in this lecture, I do intend to address each of these areas in a little bit more detail as the term goes on. So we will build upon what this lecture covers. A quick caveat to what I'm going to show you today. Several of the additional videos that I've made over the course of several years, I've used a few different versions of Photoshop. So on occasion, the tools panel may look a little bit different. Some of the panels over to the right-hand side may have slight variations. As you acclimate to working in the software, you will get used to where things are located. And while names might change slightly, for the most part, it's going to be around 95% identical. So if you do see a later video that maybe doesn't quite look the same in regards to the interface, don't stress out. Keep in mind that the Creative Cloud updates regularly. Sometimes it's a small update, sometimes it's a big one. So things may change even over the course of our semester. As I catch them, I will make updates or post notifications about those, but I just want you to keep your eyes peeled as you work, because if you do notice changes, that may be what it's due to. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post in the discussion board, send me an email, that sort of thing. I'm more than happy to help you navigate the program because it is a big one. As with any program, we're going to make a new document, file new, same on Mac and PC. This window is going to be what we're using to produce a new document. Every project through the entire term, unless otherwise indicated, I'm going to be using the letter preset. I like to use this one because it's got a width of 8.5 by 11. That's the same as a sheet of computer paper. And it automatically puts you into a print resolution. So this means if you wanted to print this out, you could. Now you can see as I clicked, it went from this setting and it had reset initially. Keep in mind, letter is the setting that we are going to be using. Let me show you this real quick. Should you want to change the orientation from being vertical to more horizontal, and you will have the option to do that as time goes on, you can see that that flip-flops the width and height settings. So you can do this manually as well by just typing in those dimensions, but a quick click of the button works that out. You can see it again, it tried to reset me for some strange reason. Back to letter. You can also pre-name your files. So you could do project 1, and you can even prompt it to save that preset. You don't need to do that, but it's just something that you can do ahead of time. When you're ready to go, click create. You'll notice as I created that second one, it named it for me already. I haven't saved it yet, but it did name that document on my behalf. So this is a blank document. If you look at the interfaces of the software, you're going to see 3 major areas. The thin panel to the left are all the tools that you're going to be using. Some of these tools, you'll notice, have an itty-bitty triangle in the lower right-hand corner. What that little triangle means is if you click and hold on any one of these tools, it's going to give you additional options. So the paintbrush tool has other drawing related tools. The marquee tool has several different shapes that you can work from. So we will go over this momentarily. Up at the top, in addition to your standard menu bar, you've also got a tool menu bar just beneath it. So as you alter what tool is selected, you're going to receive different options that are available just to certain particular tools. So if you're looking for a setting and perhaps you don't see what you expected to see, it could very well be that you simply don't have the tool selected to see some of these options. Along the right-hand side are some additional panels. Each one of these panels has a tab that you could separate, or you can nest into one another. These can also be minimized or maximized by double clicking. Some of these panels I may not use. In future iterations and future lectures, you may see some different panels here. Some panels I don't end up really using very much at all, so you do have the ability to close out a panel that's been pulled aside. So there's a little X. If I click that, it closes it. I'll do the same thing to styles. Pull it out separate, click the X to close. If you realize there's a panel you're looking for and you don't see it, you knew it had been there at one point, but it's no longer visible, you do have the ability to go to Windows. Every single panel is listed here. So I had removed my styles panel. If I check that on, it will reappear where I left it last. And I can drag it back into the document and dock it on the right side if I like to. These little double triangles collapse or expand those panels. You'll notice there's a secondary panel here as well. And that gives you additional options also. Some of these are only usable for certain types of tools. For instance, brushes. This works with the paintbrush tool. Character and paragraph, these pertain to using the text tool. So some of these on their own won't be very functional, but you will be able to go back in and make some alterations depending on which tools you happen to be using. And again, I will go into detail as we go on through the term. The two probably most important panels over here on the right you are going to be using as the term progresses is going to be the layers panel right here, and it's going to be the history panel. I am going to shrink this a little bit. There we go. The reason I made that adjustment was so that at the bottom of the layers panel you'll notice that there are a bunch of icons. These icons are going to be important because this will allow for you to create additional layers. By default, the background layer is blank. It's white. It has nothing present on it. Think of it as a blank piece of paper. When I go to work on this background layer, I'm going to always create a new layer. You'll notice that it defaults to layer 1. And if you look in the history panel, this shows that I've created a new layer. These work in tandem. Every single time you click on something in Photoshop, whether it's to make an image or to move something from one side to the other of the page, deleting an item, etc., it records that history state on your behalf. So this is sort of like a bird's eye view of every undo step that you can take to, say, undo a step that you had taken. So let's demonstrate this. I'm going to grab the paintbrush tool. I've got many presets on this computer, but I'm just going to pick a very basic round brush. And I'll pick a color. I like this purple. This is just the color panel that's open, so I'm going to just select a color and work from there. And I'm going to paint a shape. See how in the history panel, the brush tool doesn't tell me what shape I painted, but the brush tool, it shows that it's been used. If I decide, I don't really like that, I want to retry it, I can step backwards in my history state and give it another try. Okay. The reason I've done this on a separate layer is that I can alter how those layers interact with one another. So let's say layer 1, I want to see the before and the after. I can click the little eyeball icon just to the left of the preview. This eyeball icon allows for me to temporarily hide or reveal what's on that layer. I will, through this demonstration, create several layers just to give you a visual of how you can have them interact with one another. So I'll make a second layer. I'm going to hide my first layer. I'm going to start to cover each of the tools present along the left side. So the first tool is called the Move tool. Actually, I will show this again. The Move tool does exactly what you'd expect it to do. You select the layer you want to move around. Ideally, you will have something on that layer. That's why I turned layer 1 back on. And it's shaped like a little plus sign with arrows on the tips. If you hover over any tool along the left, you'll notice it'll tell you what it is. And in parentheses, it's going to show you what the hotkey to pull that tool up is. So if I press the V key on a Mac or a PC, it will pull that tool up just by clicking it on my keyboard. And the Move tool moves stuff. So I've just clicked, I'm clicking, and I'm dragging this pink S shape around on my screen. Move tool, very simple. That's what it does. It moves stuff. Pretty easy. Now I will hide layer 1. The next 3 or 4 tools here, these are all selection tools. So they select slightly different things, but for the most part, they work very similarly in that they make a selection of space or select a portion of an object for you to move only a piece of it. So the first one on the list is the rectangular marquee tool. It looks like a rectangle made up of a dotted line. If I click and drag on my screen, you'll notice that I've drug a rectangular shape out onto my screen, and those little lines move. Think of it as ants marching across a picnic blanket. I'll refer to these as the marching ants regularly throughout the term. So I have selected this region of space. Right now, that doesn't mean much because there's nothing inside of it, because I turned off layer 1. I do have the ability to move my selection around. If I click outside of it, it will recreate a new rectangular shape. If I wanted to deselect, I can just click outside of that selection and you'll see deselect. And you can visualize here how the history panel starts to build those steps up. It's recording every step that I've taken so far. If I wanted to have a perfect square, same length on every side, I would hold down the Shift key while I click and drag. And you can see that it constrains the dimensions of what I'm drawing to be perfectly even. If I let go of the Shift key, you see how it turns back into a rectangle? If I press it, perfect square. So if I wanted to select a perfect square, I have to release my mouse before I release the Shift key. So let's see how this would be used. If I turn layer 1 back on, you can see that my square selection is over my pink S. I can select, maybe I'll select just this top chunk. Because I have the selection tool still clicked, it's showing, it's in dark here, all I'm doing is I'm moving that selection. But once I switch to the move tool, now you see how my cursor looks a little bit different and it's got those little scissors next to it. Now what's going to happen is if I move what's in this selection, I'm physically separating this piece of the S from this piece of the S. So I'm moving bits and pieces independent rather than moving the entire layer at one time. You'll notice that that square tightened up around the edge of the S rather than being a box. If I were to get my selection tool and click, I would deselect it, and now I've got two separate segments. If I decided, shoot, I didn't want to separate that, maybe that was an accident, I can step backwards into my history state to resolve that. There we go. I'll hide layer 1 again. I'm going to come to layer 2. Now let's say I want to use that tool in a slightly different fashion. I'm going to pick a different color, and I'm going to get my brush again. The hotkey for the brush tool is B, B for brush. Using that selection, I can also make a change, and only that change occurs in the selected space. So think of it as I'm kind of using a stencil in a way. Only the space inside of that selection that I've drawn is going to be what's going to be altered, and it keeps the rest of my document clean. I'll deselect. If I turn 2 layers on, and I know I'm jumping around a lot, but sometimes I need multiple parts to convey an idea. By having 2 layers on, you can see that there is transparency between the 2 layers. Anywhere that I didn't paint the blue, you can see the pink through. And because they're on separate layers, I can move each piece independent of one another. I haven't permanently covered up any bits and pieces of the S with the blue. Also, layers can be layered in different ways. So if I decide, I want to see the pink on top of the blue, I can click on layer 1 and drag it up to be above layer 2, and you can see now those are interacting with one another. And you can have as many layers as you want. There's no limit. If you want to name a layer something specific, because after a while, if there's many layers, having a number doesn't do much in terms of describing what's on it, you can click, double click inside of just the text portion, and it lets you edit the content. So I'll call this my blue square, and I'll call layer 1 my pink S for right now. If you find that you can't move something, or you might notice that there's an error box, pay attention to what it says. Could not use the move tool because no layers are selected. If you look over here in the layer panel, none of the layers have been highlighted. So I would need to come in and click, and then that tool can be moved on the highlighted portion. If I wanted to move both of those pieces at the same time, click one and hold down the shift key and shift click to select both. And now I can move them both at the same time without changing their relationship to one another. Pretty simple. to reassess here, underneath the rectangular marquee tool is the elliptical marquee tool. Same concept. The only difference is with the rectangular marquee tool, it makes rectangles. With the elliptical marquee tool, it makes ellipses and circles. Same as before, if I hold the shift key down, I will get a perfect circle. If I release that shift key, it will turn into sort of an egg shape. Also, in relation to these selection tools, in the menu bar, there are a few different options. These icons here will allow for you to combine multiple selections with one another. So for instance, this one, it looks like two squares kind of overlapping, and it says add to selection. If I select that and then draw another ellipse, it combines those two selections into one unit. You can see there's no line separating the two in between. So I could just continue to sort of daisy chain these against one another, and they would combine into one big selection all at one time. The next item over is subtract from the selection. This does the opposite. This cuts a wedge out of what I've produced. So if you want to cut a hole into something, maybe I want to, cut a hole in that. Now this space, if I were to color it in, would receive color, but this interior piece, it would be like a hole in it. This last one is kind of interesting. It intersects with a selection, so basically whatever it shares with this selection is what's included, but I rarely find a need for that, so I don't often use that option. But these first three, and the first one is always going to be your default, these are going to be very helpful. If you're a hotkey person, and I am, so sometimes things will start appearing or disappearing, good to know what your hotkeys are. On a PC, Control-Z will let you undo and redo the last step. You can kind of see things jumping around in my history panel, and you can see like the corners of this crescent moon shape disappear and reappear. If I wanted to incrementally step back in my history, I would hold down Control-Alt and hit Z over and over again. You can see that just jumps me back through all the steps that I took a moment ago. So Control-Alt-Z on a PC. To undo on a Mac, if you're using one, it would be Command-Z to step back and forth. So you can see these are my two most recent steps now that I've done that. Or Command-Alt-Z to step backwards, 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 backwards. A little bit confusing. The more you use the software, the easier it will become. Easier you'll be able to remember it. On to new selection tools. The next grouping right beneath it, these are also selection tools, but they work a little bit different. Unlike the rectangular and elliptical marquees, where you get rectangles and ellipses, and that's it. The lasso and polygonal lasso, these are free-form selection tools. So you'll notice I've switched to that tool. Most of these options are the same, but now I can make any sort of wacky free-form shape that I want. So I could try to trace a shape if I had a photograph brought into Photoshop. I can just try to free-form whatever shape I want. Trying to draw a heart with a mouse is not the easiest thing ever. If you try to draw a shape and it overlaps, like it does right in the middle of this S shape, it's basically going to pinch, essentially, is what's happening there. So think like a figure 8 where it pinches right between the top and the lower segments. Same idea. Like that. Just like the other one, if I want to add to or remove from a selection, I can do the same thing. And again, referencing those hotkeys, I can hold down the Shift key to add to my selection. So I'll hold down Shift. You see the little plus sign next to my lasso shape? I can add to my selection. If I hold down the Alt key, it will allow for me to remove from my selection. So I can cut chunks out. If I hold down Shift and Alt at the same time, it's going to give me this guy where it takes a combination and only keeps what's inside. But again, freeform, draw whatever shape you want to make a selection. The polygonal lasso tool, also freeform, but instead of it being round, funky shapes, this is only going to let you make polygons. So anything with a corner. So if I wanted to make a triangle, I would click. You can see how this is sort of attached. I would click again and click again and make whatever shape I want. But once I have to come back to my starting point, you see that little circle. That means I'm completing the selection in order for it to pull up the marching ants. So if I wanted to make a star, a kind of wacky, weird shaped star, I can do that. I can make whatever shape that I want. I just have to return to my starting point. If I decide, whoa, this is getting out of control, I clicked on the wrong spot, you can hit the backspace key on your keyboard to incrementally step back every step. So if I decide, you know, I want this sort of backwards C shape instead, I can step back all the way to the beginning point if I want to. So that's one way that the polygonal lasso tool is unique to some of the other selection tools that we've covered so far. And just like the other tools, these are all options. Now, I know that with the rectangular marquee and the elliptical marquee, if I hold down the Shift key, I get a perfect square or a perfect circle. The way that that translates to the lasso tools doesn't really do much of anything to the regular lasso. But on the polygonal lasso tool, if I hold down the Shift key, it snaps that straight line to a 45-degree angle. So if you wanted to make a perfect equilateral triangle, just hold down that Shift key. To try and make that triangle have those perfect edges. So if you're looking for a specific measurement, 45-degree angles is what happens there. If I want to deselect, again, thinking hotkeys, I don't want to click out here. If I just want to make a shape and then, all right, I'm done with that selection, Control D on a PC, Command D on a Mac. This next one, quick selection and magic wand tool. I'll start with magic wand because that's been around a little longer. I'll turn one of these guys back on. So the way that the magic wand tool works is it looks for contrast. It's going to look for color or shades or shape, and it's going to try and select based on where you click. So I've selected the blue square layer. If I click in the blue square, see how it perfectly selected everything that I drew in blue and none of the white space. This works great because those shapes that I've made, and it didn't get this little guy, but that shape that I made, it's got very, very crisp edges, very clean, crisp edges. Now, if I were to bring in a photograph from another place, like an actual photo, not a graphic that I produced here, and I'll bring in, I've got a picture of a flower here. So I'll bring in a flower. If I bring this in and I click inside the flower, it's not necessarily going to click the entire flower. It's making a choice based on that specific pixel that I've clicked on. So that's where this setting, the tolerance setting, comes into play. Basically, where I clicked, it looked at that peachy, orangey, yellowy color that I clicked on, and it's looking, all right, 32 pixels around. I'm going to look all around. I'm going to try and make the best guess that I can based upon where you clicked. So I can click anywhere, but it doesn't mean that it's going to pick the whole flower. It might get really picky. It might get kind of specific, but it's not going to just, it's a little bit hard to use. Now we'll use some of the other tools that we kind of covered before. I'll hold down my shift key instead of coming up here and clicking this same thing. Hold down my I'm going to click. I'll hold down my shift key and I'll try to select as much of the flower as possible. I'm going to attempt to grab most of it. You can see, look at my history state here. I am doing a whole bunch of clicking, and while I got more of the flower, it's definitely not accurate. And you can see that it's, as I get kind of close to some colors, it's coming and picking up some of those other colors in other flowers. So if I only wanted to select this front one, now I have to worry about the fact that it's trying to grab this guy and this guy over here as well. So to sum it up, the magic wand tool, the magic part is a little misleading. It's only really magic if you've got great contrast, like you've got here. Nice sharp edges, clear color separations. It does great in situations like this. In a photograph, not the easiest route to take. I will deselect this and I'll come to the quick selection tool. Similar kind of issue. This one, instead of clicking, you can kind of click and drag, kind of like I'm painting, and it will do an okay job. Sometimes it works all right, sometimes it doesn't. All right, so for the most part, it picked up that flower pretty well. But if I accidentally go a little too far in one direction or another, you can see it will try to grab other bits and pieces. So quick selection is more accurate, usually, not always. If I, as a comparison, let's say I was trying to select this leaf back here instead of the flower. You see how, because this is out of focus, instead of sticking to the green, it just sort of said, oh, all of this sort of looks the same, and it grabbed the whole corner. Not quite as accurate. I think it saw the edges of the flower a little bit more accurately. But again, it doesn't always work that well. Sometimes it will grab more than it's supposed to, and it doesn't read your mind. It's just a computer. So it is important to be careful as you edit to make sure that you're able to get an accurate selection. This next option, the Material Eyedropper tool, only works with the 3D options within Photoshop. So for right now, we're going to skip this. And when we deal with 3D, we will deal with 3D separately. I'm going to come back to this document. I'm going to deselect, Command D, my S, and I'm going to hide these layers, and I'm going to create a new layer. So the brush tool. There are several tools here: pencil tool, color replacement tool, mixer brush tool. Most of these I'm not even going to have you touch. The brush tool I'm going to have you focus on, and that's for a couple reasons. Many other tools in Photoshop function kind of the way the brush tool functions. and you get a lot of flexibility with the brush tool. So while there are other options here, the way that we will be needing to use this tool will most likely, it'll be harder to do so using these bottom options. So the brush tool is where I'm going to cover. Now, as I mentioned before, the brush tool has a lot of options in terms of the way that the brush tip shape works. Quite a few of these are things that I've downloaded. You can see I've got hair, skin, weird textures. These are all things that I've downloaded to my computer. When you open Photoshop for the first time, you will probably only have up to about this point. You're only going to have these top sections of brushes here. But you do have the option to download additional brushes for personal use. Now, when you download that, it will only be on the computer that you download it on. It will not be on, like, say you have a laptop and a desktop. If you download a brush onto one, it won't magically appear on the other. So that's important to keep in mind if you work on multiple machines. There are some that emulate real traditional paint media. So you can see that I've got some cool brush strokes there that are kind of neat. And if you do have use of a tablet, like a stylus tablet that you can draw into, you do have, there are pressure sensitivity options as well. There are a few fun brushes that don't have much use, like, you know, blue leaves. I'll maybe make that a little bit bigger. Bigger blue leaves. Really big blue leaves. So you can get some nice whimsical effects. For right now, I'm going to stick to just the brush tool, the default itself. There are options for size. I like to use a hotkey for this because it is kind of slow for me to come in here and shift, and I can't really tell how big that is on my document. So if you look at your keyboard, doesn't matter Mac or PC, there are two keys to the right of the P on your keyboard, two brackets. These brackets let you enlarge or shrink your cursor. So if I wanted a really big shape, I would press the right bracket. If I wanted a really small shape, I'd press the left bracket. And you can see that that makes it much easier for you to alter the size and shape of your brush. There's also an option that's called hardness. And if I turn that all the way down, it's kind of the equivalent of this one right here, where it looks a little bit blurry. Same sized brush as this one, but adjusting that hardness, you can see that I get a much softer edge. It almost looks like it's out of focus, like it's a little too far away for your eyes to see. So that can give a much more soft transitional shade, which you will be using on the first project. So that's important to keep in mind as well. How are you going to use it? Opacity. This is talking about how transparent an image is, or your brush is as you use it. So if I reduce that to 50% opacity, and there is a slider as well, you can see that I can build shade up. Takes a little bit longer, but that lets me build that shading up gradually to reveal or obscure information. So that can be very useful depending on the effect that you're trying to achieve. So, you know, if I had this and made it a cloud, I could make a very more realistic cloud by varying that edge. I will go into this in more detail later, but there is a panel specifically for editing the shape of your brush. So again, using that cloud example that I just did, if I wanted to adjust the size and the shape and the way that that tool works, I could actually make a pretty realistic cloud brush from scratch without a lot of extra without a lot of extra work. So all I'm doing is just sort of playing with some of these settings. And I'll make my brush smaller to kind of test it out up here. So I could get a variety of different settings built in. The brush that I used with the maple leaf has a similar setting where they already have preset some of those items to have variation. So that's why some of those had they're slightly different color. You know, I'm seeing purple and different shades of blue in that particular tool. That's why, is because it already has presets built into it. We will go into what each of these does later on. At this moment, I'm just showing you it is available to you. But that is essentially, in a nutshell, the paintbrush tool. You can use a variety of different brush tips or stamps, if you will, to get different kinds of effects. I'm going to skip down one just because the eraser tool kind of goes in tandem with the brush tool. If the brush tool adds pigment or shapes or information, the eraser tool, which looks very similar by default, you can give it any of these shapes just like you can with the brush, but it erases what's ever on the layer that you're working on. So it erases, cuts a hole, makes whatever changes you ask it to make. Just like the brush tool, it does have an opacity setting. That's why some of it didn't entirely erase when I painted over it. You can change its brush tip, essentially. It functions in terms of the way the tool works identically. It's just adding, or rather, one adds color, one removes it. Like the paintbrush tool, there are other tools like magic eraser tool. If you think about the magic wand, it does sort of the same thing. You click it, removes stuff. It's not very accurate. Again, I don't entirely recommend background eraser sort of the same way. It's not the most accurate tool ever, and you're more likely to chop something important off than you are to have a good result. So don't really mess with these guys. They're kind of useless. Just stick to the eraser tool, or at least make a selection and then hit the delete key to remove something on a layer. You know, if I want to remove this cloud shape rather than trying to color it all in, it is a lot faster to just click magic wand. You see it clicked a whole bunch of the blue. Actually, it clicked all my blue. But if I hit the delete key, you can see it got rid of most of that work as opposed to me painting over the whole thing. So certain methods are always going to be more efficient than others. And it's just, you know, as you use it, you will see which tools are going to be more useful than others. There are some tools that are going to be useful. Not all of them, but some of them. And you'll notice that before I clicked here, there was a little 3-dot icon there. That's going to allow me to customize my toolbar. There are many tools that are going to be useful to you that aren't here. And there are some tools that are built in that maybe aren't the most useful thing ever. The next series of edits or changes that I'm going to recommend doing are going to involve the healing tools, which function similarly to the clone stamp. So I'm actually going to group some of these together. And you can remove tools that you don't think you're going to use. So like your background eraser tool, not very useful in my opinion. So I'm actually going to just sort of customize my layout. Now, if you find as you're working, oh, magnetic lasso, totally forgot him. I'm going to bring him in. As you work, there are going to be tools that you may realize you can't find that I might be using. Should that happen, keep in mind if you click that little customize toolbar, those 3 dots, you can go in and edit and add and move and rearrange the tools as you work. Again, I'm going to try and only touch upon the ones that I think are going to be useful. Like pattern stamp, I don't like, so I'm not going to cover it. Red eye can be useful, but I don't know that I'll be using that here. This whole group is useful. So I'm just kind of dragging them in, and I can rearrange how they show up here as well. Dodge, burn, sponge. So I'm setting this up based on the way that I work. You do what works for you. You can also save this as a preset. So I'm going to save that as my preset, and I'll click done. I'll jump back up real quick now that I've rearranged all that and realized I left something important out. Magnetic lasso tool. This is a selection tool, just like the other two. The difference between this and the other lasso tools is it pays attention to contrast. So I will zoom in a touch to zoom, Control plus to zoom out, Control minus. On a Mac, it would be Command plus or minus. But I'm going to click, and I'm just dragging. I'm not clicking. It's looking at the edges of that flower and noticing, there is an edge there. That's probably what I need to pay attention to. So I'm actually not clicking at all. You can, if you get to like a corner, you can click and it will pick up that point that you put in. But this gives you probably the most accurate selection that you can get, short of the pen tool, which I will be covering at a later time. If you accidentally get in the wrong spot, kind of like I did here, no problem. Just like the polygonal lasso, you can incrementally step backwards and it will delete previous points for you to get back to where you needed to be. And you can see, other than there's a little edge there and maybe a little edge here and right here, but for the most part, that's a really, really accurate selection. So I can't complain really. That tool is going to be more accurate than the other lasso tools, so it is definitely one of those to keep, maybe adjust and make sure that it is visible. And if you don't find it, again, you can come back in and add that bad boy in. There's a lot of tools that we won't end up covering just because it's not really necessary for what we will be learning throughout the term. Okay, coming back into the clone stamp and the other healing, I call this my healing group. The reason for that is that these are your beauty tools. These are the tools that you use to kind of nip and tuck and make people's skin look nicer. I'm actually going to open up another photograph to convey this. So here's a photo of a girl. She looks fine, but maybe she's self-conscious about her moles, or maybe wants to kind of adjust how her skin appears. I'm going to start with the spot healing tool. It looks like a Band-Aid with a little circular selection next to it. Works like the paintbrush tool. And I am going to make my brush size a little bigger. So I'm going to use my bracket just a little bit bigger than maybe what I'm trying to edit out. And just to show the before and the after, I opened this up. So when you open up a photograph without starting it as a new document, a blank document, instead of it having a blank background, it opens up the photograph as the background. So I don't want to edit the background layer because then it's harder for me to, back up if I run out of history states. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to make a duplicate, and I'm going to call this layer my working layers. So I'll hit OK. So basically I've got a copy here, but I can compare all my changes made on the working layer to the original. So I don't like to use, I wouldn't recommend doing any editing to the background layer. So I've edited my tool. I've got it set to content aware. So what that means is it's going to look around the area I click on and try to make the best choice. So I'm going to click, and I'm just going to kind of cover up that mole. Disappeared. So spot healing tool, best for spots, whether it's freckles, pimples, if you've got like a, you know, a scar or a wrinkle or something that you want to get rid of. I love this tool so much. It is super easy to use. Click and release. You can kind of click and paint an area, but it doesn't always come out good. So I would do that sparingly. It works great on wrinkles. If you need to get rid of wrinkles or shadows, perhaps. And I mean, if you need to work a little bigger, sometimes it can do that without, you know, I removed an eyebrow. Again, sometimes shadows or remnants are still visible. It doesn't always disappear with the first click, but it sure does speed things up in terms of editing. So I do love this tool. You can see I'm quickly racking up a lot of history states, and there are a finite amount. I don't recall how many, so I'm going to go into my preferences real quick. On a PC, preferences is located under edit preferences. If you're on a Mac, you're probably going to click on, it's going to say Photoshop up at the top, and you'd click that, and preferences would be under that option as well. But let's open up preferences, and I believe it would be under file handling, I think. Here we go. Nope, performance. So you get 50 history states by default. If you crank that history state number up, it's going to be a lot more intensive on your computer's memory. And if it can cause Photoshop to shut down unexpectedly. So unless you are very, very comfortable with understanding what the specs of your computer are, I would probably just leave it at 50. But you are able to change that if that is an option that you'd like. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to change mine. 50's plenty for me. I hit undo a lot anyway. So that's my spot healing. And if we compare the before and the after, I'll turn off the top. So it gives us an idea of where we started and where we are now. Not a fan of the missing eyebrow, so I'm going to back up a touch. Maybe bring back her cheek. So there, at least the moles and some of the bigger spots are gone. Not bad. The healing brush, which looks almost identical to the spot healing brush, the only difference is one has that little sort of almost selection option next to it and one doesn't. The healing brush tool is different in that you have the ability to control where it's sourcing from. So the spot healing, it's going to just sort of look around for you and then make a decision based on what's nearby. But with the healing brush, if I hold down the Alt key, and it's the same on Mac or PC, you see how I get sort of a little crosshairs present there? What that does, and I can click and tell it, okay, this is the area you're sourcing from. And you can see that it kind of attached itself to my cursor. And I can use that to sort of help make better choices. So if you realize the spot healing tool is really, it's not really working out too well, this tool does a much more specific job on what alterations you're making. So let's say, for instance, I want to try and touch up some of the redness on her cheeks. I can pick a spot that's maybe a little more even. I'll try to clean that up here. Pick a spot that's a little more even. You see, I am picking up the corner of her mouth, so I do need to be careful. But I am able to make some changes there. As I click, you see the little plus sign just beneath her nose to the left? That's telling me where I'm picking from. So you can tell that if I were to go right, I would get nostril right under her eye, which I don't really want. So that can help you keep an eye on where you are and just makes sure that you're not running into any additional problems. So now that this cheek is in good shape, I can source from here and try to clean this cheek up. You can see it also gets rid of some of the pores. You see there's the edge of her face. So you can see it does soften. It tries to average what you're painting over and what you started with. And it does make a better, you know, it's not guessing at what you want, but you do have to pay attention to what you do, because you can wind up with weird lines in places that shouldn't be there, or body parts in places that where they shouldn't normally be. So it does take a close eye, but it does do very, very good work. Patch tool. This sort of combines the healing brushes with a selection tool. Essentially what you do is you make a selection of something that you want to alter, and you tell it where you want it to source from. That's a very drastic change. Obviously, we don't want to get rid of her eye, but it does use a selection to make that alteration. If I switch and say, okay, destination, what that does, instead of moving that selection to where I want that to be cleaned up to, it relocates whatever was selected. Again, probably a little more drastic than we needed it to be, but it does convey the message very, very clearly. So let's use that method on her cheek. Let's say, all right, we got her cheek here. I want that skin to be a little less patchy. We'll switch it to source. You can see I got a funny shadow here from her nose. So I'm going to undo, pressing the shift key to kind of scrub upwards in my image. Try that again, maybe up here on her forehead. There we go. That worked out pretty darn well. You can see that it did pick up the shadow that was on her cheek initially, but it did get rid of a lot of the redness. So at this point, I'd probably just touch up some of those edges. You can see some of the pores are a little bit more visible here, and this is a lot softer. So I'd probably just work on the edges to make sure that it's pretty even, but that did a really quick job of getting rid of those little red spots to, you know, only having freckles like she does on her forehead. Clone stamp. Clone stamp works very, very similarly to the healing brush in that you do get to pick your starting point. The difference between the two is that the healing brush kind of still does some averaging. They do soften the edges quite a bit. The clone stamp, what you see is what you get. So if I wanted to, you know, touch up some skin over here, unlike the healing brush where it does sort of make a little adjustment, it's not nearly as drastic. I could completely repaint, you know, maybe she wants bangs. I could paint, it would pick up the hair here and bring it over here. It's a little less, it's a lot less forgiving. But if you need to make a replication of something, it does a great, great job. As an example, I'll open up another picture. Okay. An example. Let's say I want to take these leaves You can see it still sees her skin. I don't want to paint her face into this picture. I'll duplicate my layer. There we go. So let's say I want to take these leaves and I just want to cover up this trellis. That tree, vine, whatever it is looking a little bare, and I want to fill it up a little bit more. I could use the clone stamp. I'll go ahead and set it to my maple leaf shape. And I'll make the cursor a touch larger. There we go. Maybe roughly the size of some of those leaves. It's not the same plant, but I need it to be sort of the same shape. I'm going to clone, and I'm going to source a spot of the leaves right there. Woo, that is big. All right. I'm going to work a little smaller than that. A lot smaller than that. A lot smaller than that. There we go. Source, paint. Now I can see I'm getting weird leaf shapes in places I shouldn't. So I can go in and maybe adjust the settings of my brush. This is probably a little bit too scattered, so I'll probably tighten that up a little bit. I want a leafy shape, but nothing that's out of control. Try that again. Source. See, I'm able to quickly and easily sort of build up the amount of leaves. And I'm sourcing a couple times. I'm sourcing and then painting, and then if I get sort of, bits and pieces of things I don't want, I source again and paint again. But you can see that very quickly I was able to fill that up and not have it look awkward. Another difference between the healing brushes and the clone stamp is that you only get round on those shapes. And if you think about it, if you're healing up, skin or wrinkles or something, you really only need a round shape. The clone stamp gives you more tip options, and therefore it does give you more flexibility, just like the paintbrush tool does. So that looks like a much more natural edge as opposed to what I would get if I were using the healing brush. Just for fun, I'll stamp the same place. I mean, it does add in additional plant life, but you can see the color changes. The edges aren't exactly organic, and it starts to get weird. So clone stamp would work great for situations like this where you just need to continue a texture or a treatment without erasing something. If I wanted to get rid of this wire or pipe or whatever, this would work great. And I would just need to be extra careful about where I'm sourcing to make sure I don't extend the plants, like I'm getting some weird green into my wall now. I just need to be careful about that. So those are my beauty tools. We will go into that. Those are specifically going to be used on the second project, but we'll go into that later. Dodge, burn, and sponge. I'm going to go back to her with her pretty clear face. All right. Each of these tools affect the color of an image. So dodge is going to lighten. So let's say I want to lighten her hair up. I want to maybe see what color her hair is, or I want to see more texture. You can see that's brightening. If I do it on her eye, it's almost like I turn the light on in a way. So that takes all of the shadows, all of the shades that are already in the photograph, and just brightens them up naturally using the colors that are already there. I don't have to paint white over it or anything like that. It comes in a range: shadows, midtones, and highlights. Highlights are representing the lightest area, so it's going to whiten very, very quickly See, that looks a little unnatural. Midtones is what I started with, and you can see that the change is a little bit more gradual. Shadows focuses on just the dark areas, but it tends to kind of get a little gray. Which one you use is completely dependent upon personal choice, and every photograph or image is different, so not everyone is going to work the same way. I do like how I was able to kind of brighten the brown of her eye a little bit though. So dodge lightens. Burn does the opposite. It darkens. It has the same settings, but this is going to amplify the shadows as opposed to the highlights. So this is going to give me the opportunity to kind of deepen the shadows if I wanted to. Let's say I want it to look like she's in shadow on one side of her face. You can see it starts to get very warm. That's part of the reason why it's called the burn tool. Highlights, it's going to be very soft. Again, they tend to be a little bit grayer. Like you're like trying to highlight something that's pale, it's probably going to be a gray shade. Shadows gets dark and warm very, very fast. So by comparison, really dark, really quick. It looks like her skin is burned like a turkey. So got to be careful. These are those tools. A little goes a long way. You can see that the exposure, which is the intensity, is only at a quarter of the way. If I were to crank that up, it gets, again, I'm going to burn the turkey. So be careful. Build it up gradually. Keep in mind, you can always undo using your history state. Don't give me something like this if you're using that tool. A little goes a long way. Sponge. Ooh, that's big. The sponge has two settings, saturate and desaturate. This, again, pertains to color. Saturate is going to amplify the color. It might just warm it up initially, but if you overuse it, she's going to look like she's made out of lava. In this case, it's going to really do wacky things with the colors. So again, a little goes a long way. Desaturate does the opposite. It will tone down the color, and if you use a lot of it, you will eventually wind up with a black and white image because it's pulling all of the pigment out of that photo. This is considered destructive editing. This is part of the reason why I always recommend making a copy and then working off of that copy, because if you had done this to the background image and hit save, there's not a way to undo it. Even if I'm close to hitting the end of my restorative changes, and once I run out of history states, I can't undo. I can't get back to the photograph before it started, which is why I made a duplicate. So that's important to get in the habit of doing. So it's stuck that way unless I back up in my history states. All right. The paint bucket and the gradient tool. I'm going to grab a selection for this. So the paint bucket tool allows for you to grab a color, any color you want, and basically fill a selected area with that color. Now you can see, because I had some of those little blue leaves floating around, it didn't quite get all of it, but I did evenly fill that selected region with a shade. If I had, and I'll hide this and deselect, if I have a colored area and I use the paint bucket tool in that, it's essentially replacing it with one color for the other. If I don't make a selection, it's going to fill your entire document with color. So it does give a nice even treatment, but it's a very drastic change. So it's worth paying attention to what you're doing. Make sure that you're using a selection, or you're at least on the proper layer, because using that tool on a photograph may wind up with unexpected results. The gradient tool, similar. The paint bucket tool, you just click and release and it dumps color in. The gradient tool works a little bit different. What this does is it typically starts by combining the foreground color and the background color that's selected. By default, it's usually black and white. Because I've made some changes, it's a little different. I'll pick something different for the background color. There we go. So green and red in the spirit of Christmas. So the way that this works is I draw a line, kind of like if I were using the polygonal lasso tool or just drawing a line with the paintbrush tool. And what it does is it blends those colors into one another along that axis. The shorter the line, the more abrupt that change. The longer that line, and I'll go really long here, the more subtle that change. There are different settings. If you pick the radial, which basically makes it circular shape, there are a few others. These are probably the two that might get used the most if they're used at all. There's one that makes sort of like a diamond. So there are other presets. There are quite a few kind of fun colored ones, like there's a rainbow. So, and you do have the ability to make your own preset as well. This one looks like the beach or the sky against the sand of a desert. But they're very simple. You may not have a lot of opportunity to use these, but they are worth paying attention to. The type tool, horizontal and vertical. If I click, it will allow me to type text just like I would in a word processor. It's hard to see the lime green against the blue, so I'm going to pick a darker color. Just like in MS Word, this is sort of a simplified version, so I can pick the font, I can pick the size, I can pick alignment, I can add kind of a fun styled element to it. Typically, it will default, the name of the layer will default to whatever you've typed. So you can see that it's named itself based off of what was written. As long as the T is present here as an icon, you can see that's a little different from these other tools here. As long as that T is present, you can come back in and edit that at any point in time. And all of the editing tools that you may need are up here. There are additional tools, as I mentioned before. If I click on character down here at the bottom, I get a few more options. Paragraph gives me additional alignment or indent options as well, the ability to hyphenate words, that sort of thing. So you do get a lot of options. It's not as, you don't get as many details as you would in a word processing program, but since Photoshop is for editing images, if you need to edit some sort of visual content, you do have the ability to do so in terms of text. You also have the ability to, change the color, and depending on what settings you're doing, you can do more to each layer as well, including the text, like hide it and make it visible, that sort of thing. The pen tool, the path selection tool, and the rectangle tool. These are all vector tools. The difference between these tools and what we've been making so far in terms of different shapes and such is that vector shapes do have the ability to be scaled infinitely without losing resolution. The pen tool's very complicated to use. It will be required later, but I'm not going to cover it. We're kind of doing basics at this point, so I wouldn't stress you out over that right now, but I will show you the rectangle tool as an example. It works a lot like the polygonal lasso tool, except it's going to give you additional properties that you can style. So let's say I'll fill it with a color or a texture maybe. I can give it a dotted outline. I can change the color of each of these. So I've got kind of like a decorative element there, so that's different. Since that popped up in the properties panel, I'll go ahead and tuck that away. Now, just for fun, we're going to compare. I'm going to hide everybody except the square. Now I'm going to shrink both of these shapes down. So I'm going to Control or Command on a Mac click to have both the vector rectangle with all the patterns and the blue square combined together at one time. And I'm going to shrink them. So I'm going to go up to Edit, Free Transform, and I'm going to shrink them both to be itty bitty. If I want to shrink them to be the same size, like just same square, I'm just going to hold down Shift. So you can see a couple things. You can see that the vector item is moving and adjusting based on the size. So if I shrink them to be really, really, really small, you don't even see the pattern inside of the rectangle anymore. You just see the blue square and red dots here. So itty bitty versions. I'm going to make those bigger again. So I'm going to Control T, which is going to let me free transform without having to go up to Edit. And again, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and make them bigger. And since I'm running out of space here, I'm going to make them bigger separately. So I'm going to click on the blue square, Control T or Command T on a PC, and I'm going to make that bigger. And I'll do the same thing with my rectangle, this guy here. So you see how just in shrinking and enlarging, this lost quality. And this one looks the same. You know, it might have had a different number of dots around the border, but for the most part, the quality of the image, the edges, the texture, whatnot, is the same. The reason for that is this bottom one is a vector item, and this blue one is a raster layer. The difference between vector and raster is one is mathematic based on the points that make up that shape, and one is pixel based. And pixels do not stretch kindly. If you shrink it and then try to stretch it back out, things get strange. So it's important to recognize the difference between these tools or these types of file or layer elements, because some have more flexibility with editing than others. So these, the pen tool, the arrow, which is the selection tool for vector, and then the rectangle tool and all the tools within it, these are all vector items. Technically, text is sort of vector as well, only because you have the ability to make the font bigger, make the shape bigger. You know, you're not going to lose quality by making the text larger as long as the T, the text icon, is present. The hand tool is kind of similar to what I was doing before. If you can't see, or maybe you zoom way in on a photo to work, the hand tool lets you sort of scrub around to see what you're doing. In fact, if I open up the navigator, kind of does the same thing. By default, this was probably at 100%, which means you can see most of it in your document, and there's no need to use the hand tool. But when you zoom in, it can be useful. I always use my spacebar hotkey option. So if I don't want to stop and switch, I just hold down my spacebar and it pulls up the little hand. If you like the navigator, that's another panel you might like. This gives you the option to zoom out or zoom in. You can use the slider. And then that little red box represents what I can see here in my window. So I might just kind of scoot around based off of what I see in this icon. Each one of these ways is okay. I am a hotkey gal, so I'm going to use my hotkeys more often than not. But if you are more comfortable clicking on the tool and moving that way, or if you just want to come up to the navigator and kind of use that to help you focus, all of those is fine because you get the same end product. Some are a little faster than others. That's why I use hotkeys. Same with zooming. I like to use my hotkeys, my control or command plus and minus, but the zoom tool does the same thing. By default, it zooms in. You can click up here to zoom out. You can hold down Shift or Alt to zoom in and zoom out based on which tool you're using. Does the same. Navigator kind of combines the hand tool and the magnifying glass tool together. So again, whatever works for you is what I'd like you to use. We mentioned the foreground and background colors. The foreground color is typically what you're going to be using to paint if you're using the paintbrush tool. By default, it's usually black and white. If you ever have a lot of weird colors selected and you decide you need to use black and white, just click this little guy, that brings it back to default. If you need to switch or flip-flop between foreground and background colors, this little funky sideways arrow lets you switch which color is the active color to be using. Lastly, I mentioned the window panel. I'll show you all the panels here that are available in Photoshop, and if you miss something or can't find something I'm using, you can find it here. You can also alter your workspace. 9 times out of 10, I am working in a modified version of the Essentials workspace, but there are different workspaces based on what you're using. Like if I clicked on 3D tools, or 3D panels rather, would pop up. If I'm dealing with graphics and web, again, different panels are going to be prioritized. So some of these are different from others. Again, you use what works for you. You do have the ability to make a new workspace based on the way that you like to work, and that's fine too. If I have too many windows open, and sometimes I might just because I'm using several at one time, but if that's too much for you, you can close out or hide or delete as many of these themes as you need to and just save it as your personal workspace. Again, just like with the paintbrush tool, I have a lot of brushes. Whatever workspace you have is only going to be on the computer you use it on. So if you have multiple devices, keep in mind that there may be some disconnect between the two. But you do have the ability to completely alter this software however you need to do so. The top menu, if you need to print, save, etc., you would do that here. So if I wanted to save this as a Photoshop document, save file type as Photoshop right at the top. PSD is Photoshop document. This file type will allow for you to see all of the layers that you've made. So if you wanted to make sure that you could save all of these items here, save it as a PSD. Edit has options like that free transform It also lets you make custom elements like patterns, brush presets. I'll show you how to use these later. It does have a spell check option, which is new. That's great. Under image, you have the ability to alter your image size or rotation. So if you need to flip your document, you can do that. Under layer, you get some additional options, sort of like what you've got here. Type pertains to text. Select pertains to selections. So deselect, select all, these are all options I like to use hotkeys for. However, you can come up here and select it manually as well. Filter has a bunch of fun filters that you can use to edit images. I will cover these in more detail later. 3D pertains to 3D tools. Again, I will cover this later. View kind of pertains to zoom or showing information on your screen. It also lets you see additional elements like rulers or grid items, which I will cover in more detail in coming weeks. But each of these pertains to ways that you use the tools or the interface in general. So again, I know I covered a whole bunch all at one time. I apologize in advance for a very long lecture. They're usually a little shorter than this. But I will go into each one of these items in detail as we progress through the term. So my biggest suggestion at this point is play, goof off, spend a little time just making stuff and experimenting with the tools and seeing what you like and what you don't like. The reason I suggest this is the more hands-on time you have with the software, the more comfortable you get with finding where certain tools are located. And when it comes time to complete assignments, you will have a much easier time finding the tools that you're looking for and having an understanding of how they work. So use this as an opportunity to kind of goof off, and with the following lectures, we will deal with specifics on what you will need for each assignment as time goes on.